So we're in chapters 20 and 21 tonight. Does everybody have their papers? All right. If not, they should be some back by the sound booth window. Let me give us a chapter 19 recap, okay? We finished up chapter 19 with Job telling his friends he thinks it's terrible to look for a problem with Job as opposed to trusting what Job is saying, and then finished it up by telling them that God will bring his wrath on them for their judgment and lack of support. So now Job is turning the tables. They were accusing Job of not being forthright and honest about his secret sin, apparently, that he has in his life. And Job is telling them they better be careful making accusations against God's righteous people. And so there seems to be a standoff between Job and the friends believing that Job has to be sinful, which is why he's paying penance or paying for what he's done. By the same token, Job has admitted, I haven't done anything wrong, or at least nothing that I know of, so you guys need to be supporting me instead of accusing me, which is where we've been for the last, 8 chapters now? 10 chapters, something like that, maybe more. Just a never-ending cycle. So we're going to start in chapter 20, and we're going to hear from Zophar. Zophar, the Naamathite, answered, "Therefore, my disquieting thoughts make me respond, even because of my inward agitation. I listened to the reproof which insults me, and the spirit of my understanding makes me answer." And I put down here in verse 3, Zophar is undoubtedly referring to what Job had said at the end of chapter 19, that they had occasion to dread the wrath of God, and that they might anticipate heavy judgments as a result of their strong opinions. Spirit of my understanding, we see in verse 3, means the emotion of his mind. The mind or the soul would better express the idea than the word understanding. The spirit here seems to be used in the sense of violent and agitating emotions. Now, have we seen signs that Job's friends are agitated? What are some of the ways that we have seen some of this agitation? In just emotions or responses. I'm not looking for specific words that were said, but one thing kind of comes to mind is we see a lot of sarcasm. So when we see sarcasm, where's the root of that? Does that come from agitation? Does it come from irritation? Probably all of the above. Anything else that we've seen from his friends that would indicate that there's some agitation? Okay, so even times where they were not saying, or speaking and sarcastically, they were still making accusatory statements against Job, amongst other things. Who has verse 4? So when we look at verse 4, it's important to look at this based on the version that you have. This verse means this has always happened from the beginning of the world, or that this is the invariable course of events. The purpose here is to show that it was the settled arrangement of providence that the wicked would be overtaken with calamity. We've seen this before, right? The wicked will be overtaken with calamity. Why? Why do they believe that? This is the recap moment. Why is it that they believe this? Everybody during this time period believes that sin leads to destruction. And it doesn't just mean spiritual destruction, it means physical destruction on this life, right? So if we have sin in our life and we're doing bad things, what is the three friends continuously responding with? Their idea is, you clearly have sin in your life because God is pouring his wrath upon you. right? That's the idea, the general idea. But he's saying here in verse 4, this is the way it's always been. It's the way it's been from the beginning. It's the way it is now. Job is denying it, and his three friends keep saying that clearly you're hiding things. All right, who has 5 and 6? Okay, who's he talking about here? Who's Zophar talking about? He's not necessarily talking about Job. Who is he referring to? I mean, he's including Job in this, but he's using a generalization. Okay, he's talking about sinners, people who are living the wrong kind of life, that are not living a godly life. All right, and then who has 7 and 8? But then verse 9 says, the eye which saw him sees him no longer, and his place no longer beholds him. In verse 9, this is the exact same verbiage Job uses about himself in Job chapter 7, verse 8, and again in Job chapter 7, verse 10. So Job is saying the same things that he wishes he had never been. All the turmoil that he's facing and the anguish and pain that he's in, he wishes he had never been born. In this case, Zophar is saying the same thing. These sinful people, their life will fade away. Everything that they've done will fade away. And he says in verse 9, the eye which saw him sees him no longer, and his place no longer beholds him. But then in verse 10 it says, his sons favor the poor, and his hands give back his wealth. The sense here is the poor shall oppress his children. How in the world could the poor oppress your children? Or in this case, his children he doesn't have. What are we talking about here? Mm-hmm. Sure. The idea in the Hebrew seems to be that his sons shall be reduced to the humiliating condition of asking the aid of the most needy. There's nothing more embarrassing than asking for help from somebody who already desperately needs help, right? It'd be like going up to a homeless person and asking them for food or money. That's how bad off you are. Instead of being in a situation to assist others, they themselves will be reduced to the necessity of applying to the poor for the means of sustenance. Long story short, they would be beggars and beggars of beggars, asking for help for those who themselves need help. And granted, yes, we're not talking about the children that have died, but we're talking about his legacy. We're also talking about people who are living in sin, people who will become destitute. They had a very strong belief that when you live in sin, this is the kind of life that you will reap, the harvest that you will reap. Who has verse 11? If you have anything, just jump in there. Now, I wanted to put down here, the Vulgate renders this, his bones are full of the sins of his youth. Isn't that interesting? And the Septuagint renders this, his bones are full of his youth. Very interesting. However, the Hebrew directly translated literally means his bones are full of his secret things. Well, we've already heard from his friends. What have his friends had to say about this secret stuff? What did they say? Exactly right. There's no other explanation, right? That's what they believe. But the Sure. No, and you're not wrong, because in this particular instance, he was alone for a brief window of time. And then his three friends came, and everything seemed to go really well. They had fasted and prayed for 7 days. 7 days being what? It's not just the perfect number, but it's also, in this case, what? The fasting was mourning. 7 days indicates mourning. So they had been praying and fasting, mourning for Job. But then, after the 7 days, everything fell apart. So, in fact, he had mentioned in previous chapters, you guys are tormenting me with your words. You're not helping me at all. So, you're probably right. He probably would have been better off alone, but anyway. In verse 12 it says, though evil is sweet in his mouth, and he hides it under his tongue. What does this sound like to you, verse 12? Though evil is sweet in his mouth, and he hides it under his tongue. What does that sound like?
I like what the scripture says, woe to those who call evil good and good evil.
Okay. I just put down here, my first impression was a breath mint or chewing gum. Now, obviously, there was no breath mint. But when you think about that, when you have that breath mint in your mouth, where do you put it? You put it in your cheek, or you kind of hide it away, and you'll still enjoy it. But the idea here is you keep it in your mouth because it's sweet and tasty. Nobody wants candy or something in their mouth that's terrible. Does anybody? No. Now, I used to eat beech nut gum as a kid, and I've had people be like, ugh. It's black licorice gum. I love black licorice. But to me, that was great. But he's referring to the sin that Job is indulging himself in, the sin that he's partaking of. He's eating it like candy. He's enjoying the sweetness of it while keeping it secretly hidden away. So you put it under your tongue, you have fresh breath, but nobody can tell what you have in your mouth. See, that's the idea. He's indulging sin, but he's keeping it hidden away. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. Kind of sounds like we've heard this before. All right, who has 13 and 14? Now remember, in verse 12 it says, though evil is sweet in his mouth and he hides it under his tongue, comma, we're going to go on in verse 13 to hear about a little bit more about that. So what was sweet becomes what? Anybody ever have too much sweet? And you feel sick to your stomach? My life story. But the idea is, it tastes sweet, it smells good, it looks good, everything's perfect. But you indulge that, and what happens? It hits your stomach, and you have too much, and you feel sick. And that's what he's talking about here. Yet, his food in his stomach is changed to the venom of cobras within him. What does the venom of cobras do? Poison. Poison. All right. And then verse 15, he swallows riches, but will vomit them up. God will expel them from his belly. What was this? What do you think 15 means? Was Job a wealthy man? We kind of went through day one, right? The amount of his wealth. Does anybody remember, just ballpark, what kind of wealth by today's standards? We'll just say millions. So he was a very wealthy man by any standard, even by today's standards. Multi-millions. I think whenever we did the math, based on today's numbers, it was in the 100 million range. The 9 figures. So, by today's standards. Of course, some of that mutton has gone up, you know. Just all right. And then who has 16 and 17? This is to say, Job isn't enjoying the abundant satisfaction and comfort which good men through God's blessings enjoy. He is indulging on what? The lifestyle that he has sown, which is what Zophar is saying. He is indulging on the lifestyle that he has sown. You sow bad, you reap good. Right? You sow bad, you reap what? Bad. There's no other way to look at that. You sow good, you reap good. So in this case, they're saying he is sowing bad, and as a result, he is reaping his harvest. Okay. And then verse 18, who has that one? Again, he shall be forced to part with his estate to make compensations for his wrongs. So he won't enjoy what he had gotten, but it will be taken from him. It's all coming to a head. And then verse 19 and 20.
For he has oppressed and forsaken the poor. He has seized a house which he has not built, because he knew no quiet within him. He does not retain anything he desires.
Okay, he won't have any peace of mind. No peace of mind. Does he have any peace of mind now?
No.
Absolutely none. We've seen 19 chapters worth of the fact that he has no peace. Zero. Well, no, not really any. He's hoping for what? Hoping for death, but beyond that, he's hoping for one more thing. He's hoping for death, but he's also hoping for heaven. He's hoping that God is going to pardon whatever sin he's done to allow him to come into heaven, because he's been punished. So I think that's the idea. But anything he has that he truly desires will be forfeit, and he'll lose them all. Verse 20 says, because he knew no quiet within him, he does not retain anything he desires. But who has verses 21 and 22? Interesting. And then verse 23 says, when he fills his belly, God will send his fierce anger on him and will rain it on him while he is eating. So what do you believe Zophar is talking about here in verse 23? When he fills his belly, God will send his fierce anger on him and will rain it on him while he is eating. We're not talking about food, if that helps. Do what? Okay. He's talking about events. Did you have something?
I was just thinking it has to do with when Job himself gets to the point where, his finally gives it up and tells the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Then God will pour out his vision.
Yeah, well, he's saying God will send Job enough food to fill his belly, but we're not talking about food. These miseries will come upon him like rain. Have we seen that? Come upon him like rain, even while he's eating, with great vehemency, with great consistency, with great authority, with great power. But then in verse 24 he says, he may flee from the iron weapon, but the bronze bow will pierce him. Now I find this interesting because if you look at King James, it says what? Bow of steel. And I think this is important because this verse is very interesting. So the iron weapon indicates sword or spear. And Job will flee thinking that he's safe from those weapons. However, the bow changes everything. If you look at history and you look at wars, swords and maces and all these other types of weapons were great for hand-to-hand close combat. But there was a weapon that could equalize the playing field, that you didn't have to be great with a sword to win the battle. We had a bow. We could be hiding, and we could take an animal out or a person out while hiding and even never giving away our position. In this case, what is a bow good for? Distance. It's great for hunting. You can run, but you can't hide, right? Because we can pick you off even while you're running, if you're pretty good with a bow. One thing I find very interesting is the King James mentions bow of steel, but the direct Hebrew translation says bow of bronze. And we actually see this in other manuscripts, old school manuscripts. This is interesting because bows aren't made of metal. Bows aren't made of steel, and bows aren't made of bronze. And a bronze bow could definitely not shoot an arrow. Psalm 18:34 also mentions bronze bow. So we look at bow, we look at bronze. What is the significance of the bronze bow? So if we know for a fact that a bronze bow won't work, then we have to believe that there's a symbolism here. What is the symbolism, do you think? Remember, first off, the bow was used primarily for hunting, to take out an animal without being detected. But it was also a way to kill without, without hiding, or without, you didn't have to be an expert swordsman. So what is the significance of the bronze? Well, there's a symbolism. So when we look at bronze, when we look at the book of Revelation and we see what the Bible describes Jesus as, do we believe that that is the way Jesus actually looks in heaven? There was a symbolism there. When we're talking about a sword coming out of his mouth, did Jesus really have a tongue that looked like a sword? No. He's using symbolism to describe what Jesus is. And in this case, bronze is used scripturally many, many, many times as a symbol of God's judgment. So when we look at the bronze bow and then we see the arrow, depending on the translation you have, they even indicate a bronze arrow as God's judgment. So when he says here in verse 24, he may flee from the iron weapon, but the bronze bow will pierce him. You can't hide from God's judgment. Isn't that what it's saying? You cannot hide from God's judgment. No matter what you do, you can't run, you can't hide. God, at some point, I just told Amanda the other day, at some point, it's fascinating to me that we just don't realize, we don't think about it because it's always pushed off. We're a here and now people. We don't think about the idea that tomorrow or the day after, we're going to come face to face with God. And you're going to have to give an account for your life. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. But the bronze bow will pierce him. What happens when we're pierced? There we go. I like that answer. Because in verse 25, who's going to read that? Where it's going to tell us exactly how deep it is. Okay, so in verse 25, which is to say the arrow not only hit the mark, but it was deep enough, it was deep wound, and it was deadly. So when you look at verse 25, what are we talking about when we say gall? He says, even the glittering point from his gall. What's the glittering point? Well, bronze, but it's also the arrow part. What is gall? Huh? Like, yeah, so we have that inside, which means if the arrow pierces, that is very deadly. There's no way to come back from that one, unless God says so. In verse 26 and 27, You guys have anything before we carry on? Any thoughts? Okay. 26 and 27.
Total darkness lies in wait for his treasure. Fire unfanned will consume him and devour what is left in his hand. The heavens will expose his guilt. The earth will rise up against him.
Okay, in verse 26, darkness here refers to calamities. When we look at this, complete darkness is held in reserve for his treasures, which is to say, calamities. Calamities are held in reserve, which means God has more. He has more. Why? Why does he have more? Because Job is an evil person. At least that's what they think. All right, so verse 25 talks about gall. Verse 26 talks about complete darkness, which is calamities. But then unfanned fire in this regard is probable to mean the fire is of heavenly origin or possibly even lightning, which is also from the heavens. We don't specifically know what he was talking about there. But if you look at an unfanned fire, how do you get a hot fire that's unfanned? When you look at the blacksmiths, you watch the old westerns. I don't know if you have any western people in here, but the blacksmiths would use the bellows and they would get that fire really hot. That's how you could get the metal hot enough to make it pliable. But in this case, how do you get a hot fire without fanning it? You don't. In this case, that's why they believe it's a godly fire, because his fire is all-consuming. All-consuming. And then in verse 27, the heavens will reveal his iniquity, and the earth will rise up against him. The increase of his house will depart. His possessions will flow away in the day of his anger, God's anger. This is the wicked man's portion from God, even the heritage decreed to him by God. So you see, is Zophar sharing a different perspective than his other two compadres? Or is it the same? Sounds exactly the same. But once again, we're going to hear from what Job has to say. And this one I really like. This one I really like. Okay, you guys ready for this? Job chapter 21. In verse 1 he says, "Then Job answered, 'Listen carefully to my speech, and let this be your way of consolation.'" Now I like this. And this is something I'm actually considering using personally. I want you to hear what I'm saying and let that be a consolation. Since I never got a consolation from you three, listen to me and I will count this as my consolation. I just want you to hear what I have to say, which is what he's saying here. He's saying, you came to me for the professed purpose of giving me consolation. He's saying that they have failed miserably. We've seen it more than once, right? Job was saying they have failed in their job. So he's saying, if you will just hear me attentively, I will take that as a consolation and will be in the place of what he had a right to expect from them. All right, who has 3 and 4?
Bear with me, that I may speak. Then after I have spoken, you may mock. As for me, does my complaint too man? And why should I not be impatient?
See, in verse 3, he goes right into it. He says, bear with me while I speak. Don't interrupt me. Just hear what I have to say. Then, after I've spoken, you can go on mocking me. That doesn't sound like support that we should have for each other, right? That sounds pretty sad and pathetic. So, in verses 4, as for me, is my complaint to man, and why should I not be impatient? But he said in verse 5, look at me and be astonished, and put your hand over your mouth. What does that sound like to you? Shock? Awe? What does that mean? When he says, be astonished, and put your hands over your mouth. He's got the right answer. That means be quiet. Be quiet. Be astonished. What is astonished? Amazed, blown away, shocked. Be shocked and listen. Be quiet. So in verse 5, Job is telling them to look at his life. You should be astonished that a man whose life has been a life of piety should exhibit the spectacle which you now see. As a token of silence and wonder, you should remain silent. Silence. Any thoughts?
I was thinking of it like, it's almost like, for me anyway, it's like a father-daughter relationship that I have with my daughter, you know. When I'm disciplining her, correcting her, I need her to be quiet and listen to the instruction that
Mm-hmm.
the father is giving to her.
Yeah, that's a good example. And I think Job being a good man, Job being a righteous man, he's not quick to anger. He's trying to convey his opinions, his beliefs, his views, and they're not readily hearing what he has to say. So in verse 6, even when I remember, I am disturbed, and horror takes hold of my flesh. Who has verses 7 and 8?
Why do the wicked still live, continue on also, become very powerful? Their descendants are established with them in their sight, and their offspring before their eyes.
Now, see, I like this because now we're breaking off. We're breaking off. Job is asking the question which all of us are asking ourselves, or at least at some point we have. They believe that you sin, you reap a terrible harvest. But he's asking them, why do the wicked still live? They continue on, also become very powerful. He's got a question mark there. Answer the question. He says, but not yet. He says, why do the wicked still live? Their descendants, in verse 8, he said, their descendants are established with them in their sight, and their offspring before their eyes. But in verse 9, their houses are safe from fear, and the rod of God is not on them. What is he trying to ask them here? What is he saying?
I feel like he's trying to get an answer for his suffering. I mean, yeah.
If we use the logic that if we sin, bad things happen, and if we don't sin, good things happen, then the questions that he's asking blows everything apart. Because if that's the case, why is it wicked men are not only surviving, they're thriving? We see that now, don't we? Some of the most wicked people in the world are thriving. They're doing great. They're millionaires, billionaires. So we know. He's asking the question, their descendants are established with them. And then in verse 9 he says, their houses are safe from fear, and the rod of God is not on them. What is the rod of God? The rod is discipline. So when we look at the 23rd Psalm, thy rod on thy staff, they comfort me. The staff is protection. The staff is comfort. The rod is discipline. How can we be comforted by discipline? And it's kind of like what we talked about in our small group, isn't it? When we get to a place where we experience the rod of God, the discipline of God, first of all, it lets me know God still loves me. He loves me enough to discipline me. Secondly, what? He wants to see me better. He expects more from me, just like we do our own kids. We discipline our children not because we get, it's a great time. We do it because we want to see them better. We want to see them great adults. We want to see them loving God and fearing God. That's the idea. God does the same thing. He said, and the rod of God is not on them. So God's discipline is not on them.
That made me think of that other verse too, the same too. It's like it says, you do not discipline your children, you hate them.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty, what's the word?
And that's fantastic. We were just talking about that today. The idea is very simple, and that's truth. If we don't discipline our children, we don't love them. Pretty simple. In verse 10 it says, his ox mates without fail. His cow calves and does not abort. What does that sound like to you? His livestock are what? Prospering. Going crazy. They're doing great. Verse 11 says, they send forth their little ones like the flock, and their children skip about, frolicking and carefree. No worries in the world. That sounds like a nursery rhyme. Frolicking. And who has verses 12 and 13? Sounds like rich people, right? They go down in peace. Verse 14. Who has 14 and 15?
Yes, they say to God, leave us alone. We have no desire to know your ways. Who is the Almighty that we should serve him? What would we gain by praying to him?
Oh, that sounds like today, doesn't it? I couldn't even begin to tell you. I just went to pray with an individual, and this individual said that they didn't want prayer. They didn't want prayer. I said, are you sure that's what you want? And they said, yes, I'm sure that's what I want. I said, okay. I said, I will be praying for you, but I won't pray here now because that's what you want. But you look at verse 14. They say to God, depart from us. That sounds a lot like the world today, isn't it? We kick God out of our school systems, and our school systems are falling apart. We kick God out of our government buildings, and our government's falling apart. I think it's pretty obvious. We need God back in those places, period. But they say to God, depart from us. We don't desire to know your ways. We don't care about what you have to say. Who is the Almighty that we should serve him? He should be serving us. And then verse 16 says this, behold, their prosperity is not in their hand. The counsel of the wicked is far from me. In verse 16, I just put down here, wicked men have no reason to reject God because of their prosperity. Their wealth is not in their hand, neither is it obtained or kept by their own might, but only by God's power and favor. How is that so? So Job is saying he's far from approving of their opinion or following their course. So, long story short, can God take it away? These wicked people? He's saying it's not even in their hands anyway. If God wanted it, he'd take it. They're getting their reward here and now. But Job is saying here, he's far from approving of their opinion or following their course, which is to say there's a separation between the evil people who are prospering and Job, who is an upright man according to Scripture. All right. Any thoughts? The counsel of the wicked is far from me, which is to say, Job is saying, I'm not wicked. I'm not doing wicked things. And then 17 and 18, who has that? Okay. But then in verse 19, you say, God stores away a man's iniquity for his sons. Let God repay him so that he may know it. What do you suppose Job is meaning here in verse 19? You say God stores away a man's iniquity for his sons. Let God repay him so that he may know it. What does that sound like? We've heard a little bit from the conversations that we've had tonight. You guys have all touched on it, but I want to be very specific here. First of all, somebody had mentioned the sins of the father carry on to the sins of the kids, right? Generational curses. But then it says here, God stores away a man's iniquity for his sons. Let God repay him so that he may know it. What's Job asking for? Okay, what did you say?
I was saying that to restore what he has lost.
Okay.
He would have it back.
So God stores away man's iniquity. There's two right answers here. One, God's wrath and judgment is upon all of us, right? When we stand before God, we're going to be judged. So he's talking about that there, but he's also talking about the generational curses. But then he goes on to say, let God repay him, much like what Miss Teresa said, so that he can see it now. You know, when he talks about these rich people, we see in the previous verse, going down in peace into the Sheol or the grave. He's saying, let God show them their iniquity now. Let them suffer now so that they have an understanding that they're not walking with God. I think that's a powerful statement because that's what I would wish. I wouldn't want to wait till I was dead to find out that God is God. I would want to know now before I die. Because after we die, what happens? There's no coming back. There's no second chances. When you stand before God, that's it. Everything you've done up to that point, that's what we're going to be judged on. I don't think so. I mean, I think he's probably thought about that. He's probably entertained everything. And we see in, I think it was 3 or 4 chapters back, he said, I have sat and I've asked and I've wondered, what have I done? He doesn't know. So it might have been something he thought about, because they obviously believe that as well. But in verse 19, I just wrote down here, the meaning here is the sins of the father will have an effect on the sons and grandson, and generational curses. He's also saying if there is sin, God should go ahead and give him punishment while he's still alive as well. We see similar phrasing in Romans chapter 2, verse 5. Can somebody read that? Romans chapter 2, verse 5. I love Romans, probably my favorite book. Or at least one of my favorite anyway.
But because of your stubbornness and unrepentant heart, you were storing up wrath for yourself in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God.
Okay. So the people who are doing evil are storing up God's wrath. And he's saying, why don't he show them now so that they can at least see what they're doing to their families, what they're doing to themselves. And then verse 20 and 21, who has that? Does anybody have anything before we go? Okay.
I was thinking there in 21, it's interesting because
We haven't got to 21 yet.
Job 21?
Oh, you mean chapter 21.
Yeah, chapter 21. But, you know, he's asking about who is the Almighty that we should serve him, and what profit do we have if we pray to him? And then he's just kind of breaking down about evil again. So it's like in this chapter, he's kind of bouncing all over the place in his thoughts to come to a conclusion, like to come to an analysis.
But that's not Job's view. He's talking about rich people.
What are you talking about, Rich?
Yeah. So Job, I don't believe for a minute, would say, I'm not going to worship God. Who's he? He's saying that's what rich people do. They're rich. They don't need God. They don't want God. They don't have anything to do with God. But then he goes on in verses 20 and 21.
His eyes shall see his destruction, and he shall drink of the wrath of the Almighty. For what pleasure hath he in his house after him, when the number of his sons are cut off in the midst?
Mm-hmm. And then 22 says, can anyone teach God knowledge? In that he judges those on high. Verse 22, who are we is basically what we're asking here. He's not asking a rhetorical question, although he's making more of a statement. Who are we to teach or tell God how he should be God? I can tell you most emphatically, God knows how to be God better than we do. God is sovereign and will hand out punishments or blessings as he sees fit. God doesn't owe us an explanation, does he? God does what God does. And all we can do is roll with it. We can't tell God no. You know, you're not going to do that. That's not how this works. But then, let's see. In verse 23 and 24, who has that?
One dies of his full strength, being wholly at ease and satisfied. His sides are filled out with fat, and the marrow of his bones is moist.
Now remember, in a previous chapter, we had heard from Job. We had heard about the bones sticking to the skin, right? What does that mean? You remember? Emaciated? Like they're just skin and bones, right? Well, now we're talking about his sides are filled out. And then verse 26 says, together they lie down in the dust, and the worms cover them. So what is Job trying to illustrate in verses 23 through 26? He says one dies. Which one? Did we miss verse 25? Oh, well, fine. 25, while another dies with a bitter soul, never even tasting anything good. We're not talking about apple dump cake here. So in 23 through 26, what is Job trying to convey? He's talking about being full of strength, being wholly at ease and satisfied. His sides are filled. He's fat and flourishing. His bone marrow is moist. You know, he's well cared for, well taken care of. While another dies with a bitter soul, never even tasting anything good. So he's making a comparison here. So in verses 23 through 24, he's talking about those who are fat and flourishing, those that are doing great. They're practicing sin. That's who he's talking about. But then he goes on in verse 25, while another, now remember this, another, when we're talking about another here, we're talking about somebody else who is evil. So when he says another, he's talking about another evil individual. So he's making a separation here. Why is there some who are evil, who are flourishing, who are doing so well, who are fat and they're doing good, while others who are evil haven't experienced anything good? They've had bad things happen to them, never tasting anything good. I just put down here, you have one wicked person who is fat and flourishing with every comfort possible, and another wicked person who has absolutely nothing. They both die, and they both end up in the ground the exact same way. What's the end result? Hell, for both of them. One of them got to experience a wonderful life on earth, who are now in hell. Another one of them was horribly turmoiled on earth, bad things, bitterness, the whole ball of wax, who ends up in hell. Great story. In verse 27, it says, behold, I know your thoughts and the plans by which you would wrong me. Job is saying here that he understands the commentary made by his friends are largely concerning wicked men in general. Would that be the general consensus, guys? Would you say that his three friends are mostly, their verbiage is mostly related to wicked men? They are also being particularly leveled at Job as well, which is to say, they are referring to wicked men, and Job is amongst those wicked men, according to them. Yeah.
Can we back up just a little bit on the part where he said, you know, that, anyway, read it correctly. One man dies full of vigor versus the one man who had bitterness. They're both wicked.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that? Why would one be like, oh, they're wicked, you know, and the other one's just like never see any good? Why is that?
Well, but Job is asking the question. We don't have a reason, but the idea is because he's trying to create some questions in the three's mind. Why is it the wicked could prosper and the wicked could also not prosper and still end up in the same place? Because like I said, their argument is Job is clearly a wicked man, so that's why God is pouring down his wrath. And he's saying, doesn't matter. Wicked men prosper and wicked men don't prosper, and they end up in hell too. So what would it have mattered if Job was a rich man who ended up going to hell? Which is the statement that he's making. It wouldn't matter at that point. Who has verse 28?
For you say, where is the house of the nobleman, and where is the tent, the dwelling places for the wicked?
In verse 28, you're maintaining that the house of the wicked man who is prospering will certainly be overthrown, which is what happened to Job, right? He says in verse 29, have you not asked wayfaring men, and do you not recognize their witness? Now this is important. Verse 29 is important. The idea in this verse is simple. Job is asking them if they had ever consulted with wayfaring men that they might have learned from such travelers that such people were reserved for future destruction and that calamity didn't always immediately overtake them. Now, we don't have the same kind of an issue that they had back then. Think about this. What do we use now to communicate? We have phones, we have internet, we have email, we have news stations, we have newspapers. Back then, they relied heavily on people who traveled to get news. What news do you have of Bethany? What news do you have from Jerusalem? Anything good going on? So these people would rely heavily on wayfaring people who were traveling, and they would communicate with them. And he's asking them, have you never talked to these people who have been traveling to know their stories, to see that these rich people are prospering that don't know the Lord? In ancient times, information was obtained by careful observation. And guess what? It's the same way today with scientific theory, right? Does everybody remember scientific theory? Observation. We can't make good theoretical statements if we don't make good observations. Just that simple. So information was obtained by careful observation. And by traveling, they had gone into other countries would be highly regarded concerning points like this. So he's saying, have you not asked wayfaring men, and do you not recognize their witness? Verse 30 says, for the wicked is reserved for the day of calamity. They will be led forth at the day of fury. And then who has verse 31? 31, 32. We're running out of time.
Who will confront him with his actions, and who will repay him for what he has done? While he is carried to the grave, men will keep watch over his tomb.
Okay. And then verse 33, the clods of the valley will gently cover him. Moreover, all men will follow after him, while countless ones go before him. In verse 34, he says, how then will you vainly comfort me, for your answers remain full of falsehood? And I just put down here in verse 34, this verse really sums up what Job is trying to convey in this chapter. Job is asking his friends why then they seek to comfort him with vain hopes of recovering his prosperity. They have no way of knowing that, and experience shows that good men are often in great tribulation, while the vilest of men can and often do prosper. He's asking a very serious question to those three men. And next week, we're going to get an answer. Is that a cliffhanger? Okay, but I will tell you, if you guys read ahead, Job chapter 22, we're going to hear from Eliphaz again. And I'm not real impressed with his commentary. Any thoughts for tonight? Anything you can take away? we're pretty much at time. So
Joe didn't get the answers he wanted.
he didn't get the answers? He hasn't been. Yes, ma'am.
I was thinking about how these people, even though they were wicked, a lot of them prospered.
Mm-hmm.
And New Testament grace, Jesus told people they would suffer for his sake.
Yes.
So we go into it knowing that there's going to be suffering, but they wanted all things good.
Yeah, true enough. We should expect it, right? We should expect trials and tribulations. We've already said, how do we grow in our faith? If everything's always good and everything's always well managed and taken care of, we'll never grow in our faith. We can't truly enjoy the sunny days until we experience the bad weather. Really simple. So that's when we grow. Anything else? All right, let's pray. Father, you're so good to us. We're thankful for your presence here tonight. We're thankful for truth. We pray, Father, as we navigate these chapters, that you continue to reveal truth to us, ways that we can draw closer to you. The word tells us that if we draw closer to you, you draw closer to us. Father, I want to be close enough to touch you. I'm thankful tonight that you are here with us. Bless each and every person that's here and that's listening online, Father, that we just, when we spend time in the Word, we spend time basking in your presence, and I'm thankful that we have the Word, that we could freely use the Bible. In so many parts of the world, the Bible is outlawed. It's not allowed. We're so privileged here, Father. We're so blessed. I pray that we would take advantage of the freedoms that we have while we still have them. We thank you, Father. We love you. We praise you. You are good. Give us a divine appointment this week. We thank you. We love you. In Jesus' name, and amen. God bless y'all.